Right, we're ready to go. Sorry, you were clearly just looking at me sat there. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're here to discuss Matt Lawrence and Laurie Laybourn-Langton's new book, Planet on Fire. I have my slightly dog-eared copy here because I have been reading it to absorb all this information, of which there is a great deal. This is, it's a fantastic book. It's got some amazing endorsements on the back. It's definitely worth a read. An urgent manifesto for a fundamental reimagining of the global economy post-COVID-19. So we'll be discussing how we can rebuild the global economy in the wake of the pandemic and face up to the challenges of an ecological breakdown, and how the left can win a world fit for life. My name is Grace Blakeley. I'm an economist and a writer. I host a podcast called The World to Win, which you can find on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at World to Win Pod. You can also find me on Twitter at Grace Blakeley if you want to get the benefit of my obviously very interesting tweets. I've also got a book out, my own book out, The Corona Crash with Verso, which you can get from their website as well. We also have a lot of very good books out, and actually this is part of a series in which there are several other books that are well worth a read. But today we are talking about this book, this very sexy looking book, which I really like the cover, and we are being hosted by Verso and The World Transformed. And TWT, as many of you may know, is an annual festival and year-round political education project. You can find out more about TWT's work at theworldtransformed.org, and you can get 50% off Planet on Fire from Verso using the link that should be coming up in the chat right now. There you go. Definitely do that. There will be some spoilers in this discussion, but we won't be covering everything. So still make sure you buy the book. So just a quick run through of what we're going to be talking about tonight. I'm going to initially hand over to both Matt and Laurie, and they're going to talk for about 10 minutes each about the book. Then I'll be asking them some questions, and then we will also be taking some questions from the audience. So please do think about the questions that you want to ask, and then post them in the chat so that we can see them and I can put them to Matt and Laurie at the end. Right, okay, so first, Laurie Laybourn-Langton, please take it away.
And thanks everyone. It's lovely to be with you here today. It's a shame it can't be in person, but maybe we're reaching more of you because we're online today. I'll kick off by exploring some of the main themes, the problems that we've identified in the book. And we started writing this book and exploring it back in 2018. So this is before Fridays for the Future. This is before Extinction Rebellion. It felt in many ways like the mainstream political imaginary was nowhere near at all even talking about the severity of the climate crisis, let alone the full picture of what's happening across the global environment. And there are three kind of main themes that we were setting up when we were trying to diagnose the problem at the beginning of the book. And I'm going to ground these actually in the current moment. And today is an interesting time to be talking about this because we've got Earth Day coming up tomorrow, and this big summit that Joe Biden, the president of the United States, is convening to talk with world leaders about trying to up their ambition on the climate crisis. And I think in some ways we could reach the end of this year and there could be a bit of status quo triumphalism, maybe we could call it. A lot of nations sign up to net zero, so to full decarbonisation, getting those emissions down pretty much close to zero by the mid part of the century. America is back, baby, and there could be a whole raft of other things that creates this impression that the status quo is finally really giving this a go. And all of that is hugely welcome, as is the changes that we're beginning to see around economic policy, where, for example, in America, with the huge stimulus measures that are being discussed at the moment, we're seeing a situation where we're starting to ditch some of the sort of neoliberal policy set that's held us back for a very long time. And all of that is fantastic. And hopefully we will be able to have an acceleration in how we're swapping dirty technologies for clean alternatives. But I think, and this is based a lot across a lot of the work that we feature in the book. So many people have been working on this for a very long time, and particularly in the last couple of years, that kind of modified status quo approach, let's call it, could crash up against, I think, three major challenges that it doesn't have a proper answer for. And these are the ones we explore in the book. The first is power. And, we know that, particularly in this sort of neoliberal political imaginary, ideas of power, who has it, how they use it, the structures that guarantee and continue that power, that all of that is not something that the status quo is necessarily challenging. And when we look, for example, at a lot of the efforts to try and get financial institutions, banks and others, efforts that are championed often by mainstream figures like Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, a lot of the time those measures are voluntary and they don't recognize the huge power imbalances that exist across the world that stop us from being able to hold certain institutions like financial institutions to account. And in the book, we feature the story of how the history of the development of the global economy, the emergence of a global capitalism, and the imperial era, all inherently related to our current moment. You cannot understand the environmental crisis unless you understand how the destruction of people as well as planet is intimately related to the events of the last 500 and not just the last 50 years. So there's a big problem with power. The second problem, I think, is around consumption. And this is where it's really important to remember that it's not just a climate crisis that we're dealing with here. Soils are being depleted, animal and plant species are being destroyed at an astonishing rate. Many species, as much, we estimate about 1/8 of the species that we know of could become extinct in the coming years and decades. And all of that isn't just a set of discrete crises. You've got the climate crisis over here, you've got the biodiversity crisis or extinction crisis over there, you've got problems with water here. They're all related to each other. You cannot separate them. This is an overall onslaught on the natural world. And the biosphere, the Earth's life support system, is being shocked and destabilized in a way that has never happened, not just in human history, but in some areas, millions, if not billions of years. And what that means is we've got to ask ourselves the question of, can we swap all of the dirty stuff for the clean stuff quick enough? Have we got enough environmental room, enough of an environmental budget of emissions released and soils depleted to do the swapping and to do so in a way that continues to allow the growth in high material consumption Western lifestyles? And that is a huge question and a huge risk stands over the strategy of just saying, no, do you know what? We have enough environmental room and we will keep expanding this Western consumption lifestyle on and on. And we will be able to transition to a more sustainable way of life within that paradigm. And that is a huge risk, a massive bet. Maybe one of the biggest bets in history is being made when considering that. And of course, that doesn't incorporate an idea of how those lifestyles themselves probably aren't the best ones for our health, for our mental and physical health, and for other factors as well. So consumption is the second area, and through that, understanding that this is more than just a climate crisis, that I think this modified status quo approach is going to struggle with. And then the third is fairness. As I was alluding to earlier, this is fundamentally an issue of inequality and injustice. Those countries and communities, so within countries themselves, who have contributed least to the problem are often those who will experience it more severely, who are most vulnerable because they may not have the resources to be better prepared to deal with it. And that's something that cuts, as I say, across and within countries. And of course, there's an acute intergenerational element to that. Including that into the future, a lot of those parts of the world, particularly in the global south, who have contributed least, who are in many ways most vulnerable, are also very young compared to the average age in countries like the UK, where I am now. And so this is a huge issue of unfairness. And I think that is something that the mainstream imaginary also can't properly comprehend or doesn't necessarily have the policies to deal with. And that's not just a moral issue, something that people who've always spoken about global equity and boring lefties writing in The Guardian are concerned about, though those issues are absolutely valid. It is an issue of critical practical importance. Similarly to what the pandemic has shown us, we are as strong as our weakest member, and we can only maintain the cooperation we need to deal with this huge global challenge if we reduce inequality, we ensure that fairness is at the forefront of our approach to this, not just at home, but also across the world, so that we can maintain the cooperation that we need. And across the first part of the book, we explore how power, consumption, and the wider environmental destruction and fairness are at the very heart of the disjoint right now between over here, the kind of mainstream response, which we must welcome and recognize is improving, and then the enormous body of work of campaigners, of Global South diplomats, of practitioners in business, people who are imagining and delivering a new economy at home in their local communities. And that work through many generations that exists and has recognized that this is the culmination of hundreds of years of inequality and destruction of peoples and of planet as well. And the book tries to provide a little bit of a journey, expressed partly through our own journey of discovering more and more where those people are, what they're saying, and how it now does form into a cohesive body of work of a proper alternative that is far more credible in offering a way out of what is the greatest crisis that not just people have experienced, but the planet itself, at least for a very, very long time. And I will pass back because I think Matt is then going to talk about what the contours of that alternative could be. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Laurie, and hi everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm Mathew Lawrence, co-author with Laurie of Planet on Fire and director in my spare time of a think tank called Commonwealth. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I want to sort of, just build off what Laurie said and try and sketch some sort of, I guess, our arguments in terms of what we need to do in the face of a planetary catastrophe and crisis. It builds on, the key argument in the book, which is that the climate crisis is in many ways overwhelmingly a political crisis, a crisis of power and inequality, and a crisis that emerges from the deep dynamics of capitalism and capitalist development. And therefore, we can't sort of tinker or tweak our way out of this, even if some marginal measures can make a difference. And at the core of that is sort of two arguments around what we need to do to begin to sort of strategically reorient itself. So the first is to insist on denaturalizing our world. So to insist that the social relationships, the economic institutions that govern our lives, these are cast as natural. There's a lot of political effort to cast these as natural, but they're actually made by us and therefore can be remade to generate different outcomes, different ways of organizing our social and economic lives. And at the same time, sort of insisting that actually we have it in our power to transform these institutions of the market, of power, that are sort of cast as natural and permanent. At the same time, we also need to insist that, as Jason Moore argues, sort of a theorist of sort of the capitalist scene, this era of capitalism has transformed our earth, insisting that capitalism is a way of organizing nature, and that in doing so, we need to make sure that as well as denaturalizing, we need to re-embed our societies into natural systems, into the systems that we rely on as human societies. So whether that's sort of ecological and natural systems, whether sort of soil fertility, sort of just the ability to absorb carbon into the atmosphere without catastrophic heating, through to, of course, the unwaged labor that's obviously deeply gendered, deeply racialized, of social reproduction that capitalism completely relies upon to function. So there's that twin drive of denaturalizing while also re-embedding in nature. And to do that requires challenging the foundational institutions of capitalism that are driving us with propulsive force towards sort of ever greater temperature rises, ever greater environmental crisis, whether that's the for-profit corporation that dominates production, an overmighty and excessively financialized financial system, the fact that most of us rely on selling our labor power to live and reproduce ourselves, this endless desire to expand and accumulate as a sort of the DNA of the system. And I think the hope is that we know the tools to bring back a future of sort of flourishing life for the many. And we know that in some ways because some of these tools have, in a sort of weird half-life, re-emerged onto the historical stage during COVID. So whether that's democratic planning, whether that's the socialization and direction of investment and of resources to meet needs rather than profits, whether it's exactly that prioritizing needs over accumulation in how we organize our business or how we organize labor markets, there's been sort of the green shoots of how we can begin to address the crisis. But we kind of argue there's three sort of central sort of groupings that we need to do. So we need to democratize production. So instead of a world in which the few control and direct production for profit, we need a world where everyone has a stake and a say, and production and exchange is organized to meet environmental and social needs and human flourishing. We need to decommodify provision, bringing more and more of life outside of the market and outside of market relationships and into new relationships of equality and sort of deeper freedom, deeper forms of freedom than capitalism offers. And of course, we need to decarbonize our energy systems. And that also means things like our land systems, our food systems, our transport systems. They're all deeply interconnected and the challenge is acute. So then we sketched in the books of 5 areas where this might go on. And I'd urge you obviously to buy a dog-eared copy or not of the book. I'd urge you to sort of dig deep into it. We sort of stress 5 areas, interconnected areas where this could come together in an agenda. First is in sort of finance, so this vast planning system that we have to sort of scale alternative forms of the future, depending on what we invest in, depending on what we choose to sort of build. At the moment, far too much of that is obviously going into fossil fuel infrastructure and unsustainable ways of living. But a sort of financial system in which investment is socialized and directed towards meeting needs over profit can scale the type of abundant infrastructures and institutions we need. So we look at sort of public banks, new models of approaching central banking, and of course the vital role that public investment can play in supercharging a transition to a world of post-carbon luxury for all. We also look at the commons, the idea of sort of the democratic stewardship of the foundational institutions and resources we need to thrive. So capitalism is in many ways stands completely antithetical to the commons. It is based on expanding, closing, extracting, exploiting, and commodifying the resources we need to thrive. So in the book, we sort of say, well, actually a counter movement, a 21st century commoning movement is a critical element of escaping the boundaries of environmental crisis. So whether that's looking at green urbanism, whether that's looking at mobility as a commons, whether that's a new politics of technology, data, digital infrastructures, and commoning the things that emerge out of our sort of common efforts, there's a whole host of sort of ideas and sort of arguments in the book around the future of democratic commons. We look at ownership as a tool to transform both wealth, but also how the economy operates. So looking at how the corporation is an institution which currently governs much of our world, but actually is an institution that emerges not from the market, but from politics and law. And therefore, as I said, it has that potential, if we can then mobilize the democratic power, to reimagine things like the corporation to serve needs rather than sort of being a key driver of environmental breakdown. We look at work. We don't really buy into the argument that the robots are about to arrive and take all the jobs. But what we do say is we need to fundamentally transform the world of work as we begin to build out the institutions, the infrastructures, the ways of life of post-carbon sort of futures that are just and equitable for all. So whether that's looking at a minimum income guarantee, whether that's about expanding democratic planning and new sort of forms of power for labour, whether that's waged or unwaged, there's a whole host of things we can do to unpick that. And then we look at a new future of internationalism, because you cannot address the climate crisis with justice unless you do it with a new form of internationalism. That's both completely, in some ways, reimagining the institutions that govern the global economy. So whether that's the IMF, the World Bank, things like the EU, there's sort of deep reforms we set out, the trading system. But then also it's about sort of reparative action. So repairing both past and ongoing harms in a sort of deeply racialized hierarchical global economy. So we look at sort of the fair shares principle of the rates of decarbonization, and also ways of repairing past harms through the transfer of technology, resources, and other forms. And I guess in some ways the challenge, and in some ways that's what would be good to get into, is if this is overwhelming a political crisis, and we have a sort of sense of the tools we need, but we simply can't deploy them, then the question becomes a question of politics. So how can we actually go from a world in which sort of that future, we can envisage it, but we can't win it, to winning that collectively together and moving forwards? And so we end by sort of drawing on a set of historical examples of both social movements, but also sort of political paradigm shifts, most notably how the sort of neoliberal sort of right sort of won the crisis of the 70s through a sort of shock therapy, and draw out examples which, of course, we argue we need to be completely differently used, bending towards justice, bending towards democracy rather than sort of the concentration of power. But in doing so can win a future of life. So whether that's developing social power, whether that's prefiguring institutions, there's a whole set of things we end on. So we end with a sort of medley of options around being in and against political parties, around thinking about how we can contest and reimagine the state, around how we can build social power through social movements, and how we can begin to prefigure an alternative world, a new world, by building out today the future of post-carbon luxury that we all deserve. It's all in there.
Thank you so much, Matt and Laurie. That was a fantastic introduction. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions now, then we're going to open up to the audience. And we have been getting some questions in the chat, so please do carry on posting your questions for the authors. So I think one thing that your book really departs from is something that you see a lot in the environmental movement, which I don't think it's unfair to describe as kind of an apolitical stance, the kind of beyond politics idea that, all we really need to do is kind of show people what's going on when it comes to climate breakdown, and then, everything will just change. Can you talk about the reasons why it's impossible to separate out climate breakdown from capitalism and imperialism more generally?
So we feature a story at the beginning of the book around Easter Island, and this is a sort of classic frame that's often used in some environmental communities or elsewhere, that this island, sort of right out there in the Pacific Ocean, was itself a sort of enclosed space in the way that the planet Earth is among the solar system. There's nowhere to go. And the orthodox story here is that the islanders overused their natural environment. They cut down all the trees. They destroyed basically the natural foundations upon which their society was possible, the ability to grow food, all this kind of stuff. And the society collapsed. And when Westerners arrived in the 1700s, I think pretty much exactly 299 years ago, they found a society that had clearly fallen on hard times, where people had turned on each other because they had eroded the conditions upon which they could have their society. And the problem with that story, which is often used to show that, the reason why we're in the bind that we're in is because of our short-termism, the fact that we've chosen certain bad technologies, or that we're just really bad at organizing ourselves. The story is untrue. And we know this from more and more archaeological and other evidence that people have accumulated by going to the islands. And actually what had happened was that when Westerners arrived, they brought with them diseases. They went on slave raids to the island. They brought sexual diseases to the island. They indiscriminately killed the indigenous population. And that's what led to the catastrophe that then is used to talk about these sort of, short-termism and other problems that human beings have. But the people going to the island weren't just doing it for a laugh. They were going there because they were pushed there by the incentives in these massive global economic systems that were growing up around the world at that time. They went there to basically exploit the natural world. It became a sheep farm for a Scottish sheep farming company, and to exploit human beings, and to get the cheapest labor of all, which of course is slavery. And we featured that story, which others are starting to tell, because it provides a much more useful story to understand the bind that we've got ourselves into. And two, the fact that the sort of orthodox story is the one that people have in their minds, and not the true story, is itself a sort of metaphor for the bind that we find ourselves in. And I sympathize with the environmental movement, and you hear Extinction Rebellion sometimes say this, that this kind of needs to be above politics. And I think by that they often mean party politics, that there should be a kind of consensus among parties to have action on this. But of course, it's far more complicated than that, because one of the most political things that you can do is talk about having to change how the economy is structured and how society is structured. And it's interesting that now, and you don't often hear this in media narratives, the scientific community is saying that is sort of arithmetically kind of the result of what needs to happen now, that the modeling that they do says that to hit the kind of emissions reductions we need those deeper changes. And if you don't have analysis of power, if you don't have an analysis of how you've got to change your economic structures, the kind of causes of the causes, then we're bereft if we don't do that. And not just because of the environmental destruction, but also because we will waste the huge benefits of changing our economy, because many of the things we need to do to deal with the environmental crisis are precisely the things that we should have been doing anyway to live happier and healthier, more efficient lives.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, I think part of the reason you can't separate it is because you can't separate some of the the drivers of environmental crisis from models of capitalism and sort of the operation of imperialism. And so one of the historic sort of central features of capitalism, whether it's of merchant capitalism, industrial capitalism, sort of digital capitalism, they all share, in some ways there's deep continuities in all of those. So you don't want to sort of go down a sort of like, well, this form of capitalism is particularly bad. But one of the things that goes through all of them is the appropriation of new frontiers of value. So whether that's from the household, but of course from nature. And so one of the chapters we have sort of opens with sort of Bolsonaro, who in some ways embodies sort of many of the sort of trends of sort of like an eco-fascist political strategy, political imaginary, in how he sort of worked with a series of sort of fossil capital interests in Brazil and beyond, because Brazil and the Amazon are completely bound up in sort of global circuits of commodity exchange, of capital accumulation. How he sort of worked to sort of completely open up and ransack the Amazon for profit. And that is sort of not something, that's not because Bolsonaro is a sort of particularly because he's a bad guy, although he is a sort of deeply bad guy. It's because there's sort of certain logic, certain dynamics encoded into sort of how capitalism operates and how that's bound up into sort of forms of contemporary imperialism that drive these outcomes. And so we could sort of it's not possible in some ways to layer on, and it's certainly not possible to layer on with justice a world of equity on top of those sort of constitutive features, whether it's how we organize our financial system, how we organize sort of labor power, the purpose, the sort of direction, who directs our economy towards what ends. These things are sort of deeply systemic, and a systemic crisis therefore sort of demands naturally a systemic response. And you sort of simply can't get that if you're not beginning to go to the root of those bigger issues that you're talking about, Grace.
So what policies would both of you like to see in the wake of the pandemic as part of a global Green New Deal? You've got a huge list of policies towards the end of the book in a whole bunch of different areas. I'm thinking, what in the wake of the pandemic should we be demanding? What should we be organizing for? And how can we kind of frame those demands in a way that makes them winnable?
I'll throw one out there quickly. The fair share approach that Matt alluded to earlier, I think, is key. So this is the idea that the position that we find ourselves in environmentally is based on the accumulation of destruction over time. So take just the climate crisis element of it. Think of the atmosphere like a bathtub. It's the amount that you fill it up that is the problem. What you're pumping into it is like the tap, and every country has a tap and they're pouring water into the bathtub, right? And when it reaches a certain level, that's when we get into serious trouble. And we've already surpassed safe levels as it stands. And there's already fatal disruption around the world. And that when you understand that, and that's very much in touch with the science, you then have to look at what certain countries have contributed, right? So the UK has contributed about the 5th largest amount to that bathtub, to that cumulative bathtub. And that's partly or mainly because the UK started, a lot of those emissions started here with the Industrial Revolution. And we say the UK, not to point a finger at any of you that on this call right now who are from the UK. Obviously you didn't do that, but the UK is the sort of legal entity as a state that exists through time, is responsible or connected to about a 5th of emissions, right? And the UK also benefited from that. Many people in varying degrees are benefiting right now, current generations are benefiting right now from the fact that the UK is, by some measures, the 5th wealthiest economy. And that is to do with the fossil fuel era in large parts. And so the fair share approach says, okay, well, the amount of emissions that you need to be reducing needs to be better tied to that cumulative amount. And through a bit of modeling, which a number of groups have done, we can conclude that by 2030, a fair share is not the kind of 2/3 or slightly more that the government has signed up to right now of emissions. So reducing our emissions by 2/3 on the amount that we're releasing in 1990. It's actually probably about 200%. Now that's physically impossible to do that on this island in the UK. And what you therefore do is to do as much as you possibly can by 2030 at home, and then you engage in certain practices to make sure that you contribute to an overall reduction equivalent to 200% of your emissions across the world. And that can be done through a range of things, through money, through investments, through all these kind of things. And crucially, that has to be done in a way that isn't like the approach to international relations that we've seen in the last few decades, where it's quite exploitative. You know, it rightly falls under accusations of neo-imperialism, like many countries in the global south have been saying. It's got to be very much a case of being a supporting partner to help expedite those emissions reductions abroad, and do so in a way that really benefits and has the absolute control of those countries who you're helping do that in. So that would be my one.
Matt?
Yeah. I think in some ways it's the urgent question, because the challenge is not, do we have transformative ideas? Do we have energy? Do we have sort of a sort of new world to win on our side? It's a question of like, how can we win the power, not just in the state, but in a whole sort of set of institutions and social formations to actually affect that, and to actually change the world, not just to sort of dream of that world being changed. So I think there'll be three things, and I think in some ways we've got sort of like a dual strategy within sort of the book of like, how do you build alliances with mainstream opinion, liberals, social, a big boat essentially to win sort of non-reformist reforms. This idea of reforms that can be winnable within the current context, but actually do begin to set your economy, your society off into sort of quite radically different institutional trajectories to the present, to the status quo, but then also building social power for potentially ruptural moments of either crisis, of opportunity, where you can kind of really sort of have a breakthrough moment and really transform things. So I guess there's sort of three that I've actually pointed towards in terms of how can we sort of take advantage of like the deep disturbance, but also how this crisis has kind of sort of surfaced questions of solidarity, new forms of living, new forms of sort of communing over the last year or so, however hard it's been for everyone. So I think first of all, we'll be sort of looking at something like a minimum income guarantee. So like the deep inhumanity and sort of bureaucratic nastiness of the UK's welfare state, can that be translated, and that's been very hard to starkly revealed during the crisis, can that be sort of translated post-crisis into a minimum income floor for everyone? Now, why does that matter for both social justice, but also sort of decarbonisation? Well, it means you begin to sort of de-stress the need to work and sort of produce to get the income to live. And so you begin to be able to thrive outside of the market, and that begins to reduce some of those pressures. The second will be thinking about where are we strong and building out from here. And someone like Owen Hathaway sort of writes very well on this, where it's like, well, actually, where socialists, if you want to call it that, but essentially like the broad left is strong are in cities. And now that might be a problem in sort of like national level politics. But for now, we should be thinking of cities as real like incubators of a transformed future that are sort of present today. So we should be thinking about like, how can we have new networks of, cycling network, basic things, winnable things, but more cycling networks, publicly owned electrical vehicles of networks, sort of new forms of, sort of public energy companies that are decarbonized, winnable things that you can then be able to scale. And then I think the other thing would be building momentum towards COP, where, in some ways, don't sort of, focus on demands on things that are foundational that we simply have to get right if we're going to sort of decarbonize. So take something like the steel industry, which is not really often discussed in terms of sort of our response to the climate crisis, but it's roughly 10% of all global emissions. And yet we know sort of the technologies, in fact, there's a publicly owned sort of company in Sweden beginning to decarbonize steel. We know the technologies, it's just that the market's not delivering. So it may well be beginning to build social pressure with unions, with sort of civil society organizations, with activists to say, actually, let's take a series of foundational industries and technologies, and at COP, make sure there's a global demand to transform some of these like basic sort of technologies we need if we're going to sort of make it through towards a sort of livable world going forwards.
And finally, before we open up to questions from the audience, and do keep posting your questions in the chat, we've got some good ones lined up, but there's space for more. It's easy to be fatalistic during moments like this, in the middle of a global pandemic, when we're facing all sorts of kind of existential threats to humanity, and when we're facing rising inequality, all sorts of kind of state forms of violence and authoritarianism all around the world. But you warn quite strongly against that kind of pessimism in the book, which I think is refreshing, not least because it plays into the hands of eco-fascists who say things are going to get worse, time to put up the borders, time to kind of, protect what's ours. So my final question is going to be, how do you both stay hopeful?
I think so. The thing that keeps me, there are a couple of things that keep me going. One is that, or let's say three. One is that I'm at the beginning of my 30s, so I've got the average life expectancy for someone like me is probably another 50 years, and so it's kind of all that I've got to all that I've got to grapple with is trying to face up to this problem and be a part of efforts to try and do something about it. The second is that we are still in a situation, no matter what you sometimes hear with bad science, that and misrepresentation science, where physically we've got the capability to be acting on this. And this is where frames that are often used, you sometimes hear them that talk about like a cliff edge, are not the right kind of mental model to have, right? That, things are really bad and suddenly the world will start to fall to pieces and we'll just fall off the cliff. Or politically, there are such inertias to making change that if we slammed on the brakes, our momentum would still take us over the cliff. And that's not the best model to have in our minds, partly because for some people, it does feel like they've already gone over the cliff, and we really, really must have that at the forefront of our minds. The second is that there isn't going to be that kind of moment, probably. What we're facing is more like driving along a smooth road and going off that road onto a sort of bumpy alien topography, which leads downwards and probably a cliff edge at the end when we get to higher temperatures and more destruction. And that is catastrophic, globally catastrophic. But there's a long way to go before we get to that. And what that means, bringing me on to my third point, is that we have to stay on the kind of saddleback, like sitting on a horse between kind of two poles. On one side, flipping over and falling off the horse toward the direction of a kind of almost hysterical, sometimes technological utopianism that often doesn't face up to the scale of the challenge, both in terms of how bad it is environmentally, but also how we need to change our economies and societies. And on the other side, a kind of fatalism that borders on the misanthropic of we just can't do this, it's too late, we're going to have these massive methane burps, they're going to mean the world falls to pieces tomorrow, that kind of stuff. And both of those have kernels of truth, and I can completely sympathize why people sort of feel that way. But we have to stay on the saddleback between them. We have to stay upright on that horse, because that is what the situation demands. And at the moment of maximum peril, you can freeze, to just be lobbing metaphors everywhere, in the headlights of that moment. But it fundamentally misreads the current moment, which is, now is the time to go for it. And no matter what the odds are, how vertiginous they are, for me, this is the moment to act. And that responsibility, particularly from being someone in a part of the world that is far more insulated, and in some ways, parts of the community that are far more responsible for this problem or contribute to it disproportionately, that is a daily responsibility to wake up and to concentrate on that. But of course, that doesn't in any way take away from the fact that this is extraordinarily scary and hard for people, and we really must care for ourselves and others when we think about that. So that's kind of it for me. I don't know what your thoughts are, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's that famous sort of Gramsci line that always gets wheeled out about morbid symptoms in the interregnum. But I think there's another one on this question of hope, which I always like, which is like the challenge of modernity is to live without illusions, without becoming disillusioned. And I think in some ways that gets at where we can draw hope right now. So I think I don't think hope is a sort of like, oh, it'll all be okay, and actually, well, we can just get Bill Gates to come up with a technical fix and we can just go on with our lives. I think radical hope is in facing up to sort of the starkness of the challenge, but then also finding strength in the extraordinary capability and extraordinary resilience of ordinary people and communities, and in that lies our greatest strength. And I think exactly by facing up to where we are, how we got here, that's how we then can collectively go forwards in hope, because we know how to get out of it. It's just a question of building that sort of social power, building that collectivity, that democratic capability to reimagine our world together. And so I think, yes, it's a sort of deeply stark, dangerous, and sort of politically volatile moment, but I think there's both always hope, and there's always the more we sort of face up to it, the better equipped we are collectively to move forwards.
Right, so now we're going to head over to the chat, where we've got some questions from the audience. So one I'm going to pick out here is, how do we avoid these policies unequally hitting the working class, as the yellow vests have highlighted in France?
So I think one of the things, and great question, and one that is that example, particularly of the yellow vest, of the gilets jaunes in France, is often used. I've been in many sort of meetings. I do policy research and stuff like that, and I've been in meetings where that's sort of thrown around. And I think the first thing to note is that when the action that was taken that was the proximate cause for the riots that we saw in France was happening, changes to fuel duty and things like that, there were also changes going on simultaneously that were cutting taxes in a way that disproportionately benefited the very top 1% of earners. So there are these graphs, you can find them on the FT website, where it looks at the impact across the distribution from the lowest to the highest earners. And it is so skewed to benefit a small number of earners, with then I think even a negative impact upon people down the earning gradient. And so the first thing to say is that, you know, this kind of story that we often got of that being a massive moment where there was a big backlash is one that we need to inspect a little bit more to understand how there were other things going on at the same time that were benefiting other groups, very wealthy groups, disproportionately. And I think that was partly what was at the heart of a lot of the grievances at the time. The second thing I would say is that there's so much that we can do to bridge the gap between what is often seen as an abstract global concern of liberal metropolitan elites, and then the lived experience of people who are in communities, in lower income communities. And fantastically, a lot of the ideas that are being developed that have been around for a long time, as well as presenting themselves in frames like the Green New Deal, are ones that bridges the gap between the lived experience over here of people on lower incomes who've been disproportionately disenfranchised by the last 30 to 40 years of neoliberalism, and then what we need to do to improve action on sustainability. So providing good quality jobs, allowing a transition of communities that respects the kind of things that they need. As Matt was saying, we're talking here, you know, things like cycle lanes and replanning cities. If you've ever felt bored by them, I felt bored by them as well. They seem so techy. They're, you know, seem to be argued for by a particular community or whatever, but they're extraordinarily exciting because for what seems like an age, we're going to start to think about shared public luxury in a way that was denied often by many political parties over the last number of decades. I don't know if you all,
Yeah, I mean, a world in which I think that's a sort of really important question, a sort of key political challenge, and certainly the sort of challenge, and you can kind of see it mutating very quickly, of, you know, Nigel Farage will, you know, re-emerge, or a Farage-like figure will re-emerge to say, you know, any effort to stem, you know, sort of environmental breakdown is, you know, an elite project foisted by people living in London, and it's going to hit working class people hardest. And, you know, obviously this will be like incredibly like racially coded, class coded. There'll be a whole host of nasty things in there. But I think what our response has got to be, well, actually exactly the things, as Laurie says, exactly the things to build a world of sort of post-carbon luxury are the things that will benefit the working class, those who've been at the sharp end of 30, 40, well, centuries of economic development. Those will be the people who will benefit most, you know, from a world of, you know, beautiful, luxurious public parks and public housing, of work that's organized with dignity and sort of security and sort of income that sort of supports thriving lives and thriving capability. So in some ways, exactly, of course, it has to be designed well, but exactly like the powers we need to mobilize to win that world will necessarily mean that the interests of the majority and of ordinary people, and working class people in particular, will be centered in both the transition and the outcomes it generates. And there's a sort of great line in a book, another Verso book by Aaron Benenev that came out recently about social abundance as a social relationship, in that sense that we have the capability, the extraordinary ingenuity that humans have as a collective to build a world of genuine abundance. It's about reimagining some of those institutions that, as I said at the start, are cast as natural, you know, law and sort of, you know, market institutions, and, you know, some of the things that I see Mick's mentioned, the thing around Bank of England, IMF. These are cast as natural, but actually have the extraordinary power, expansive power to reimagine our world, and we just need to contest and sort of have a plan both to sort of reimagine them, but also a sort of a plan to build the power to sort of force those changes through.
So the next question, any thoughts on how to influence decision makers like the Bank of England, the FCA, the IMF, etc.? They make the rules and we won't have change without changes in the rules. This might be a good opportunity to talk about some of those policy recommendations that you've got in the book around finance in particular, but also kind of international institutions.
Matt, do you want to jump in first on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting question, and I think it's been really interesting and noticed by quite a few people, I guess, that some of these sort of institutions that make mentions, the IMF, the bank, the FCA, and others, which historically have been sort of bastions of the status quo, bastions of exactly the policies that have been deeply problematic, are in some ways sort of really exploring the boundaries, at least sort of in working papers and sort of some of their discussions, how to begin to reimagine that. And if you take something like the sort of central banking, the Bank of England, I think what's really interesting there, and we've seen it throughout sort of the COVID crisis, but also during the financial crisis, the central bank in any capitalist economy is sort of the key agent of planning. Monetary policy is a form of planning. It sort of decisively shapes how sort of market relations operate. So, markets don't exist outside of sort of forms of public planning, but are completely bound up in that. And so, whether it's how they sort of can support public spending via the bank potentially sort of buying, the treasury bonds to enable sort of increased investment in green technologies, green industries, green homes, whether it's about sort of the balance sheet and sort of the type of assets the bank buys in terms of its corporate bond buying and other things, whether it's about sort of how it begins to channel credit into the economy. There's a sort of huge range of things that the bank, as this key agent of planning, can do. And what we have to do is contest and make sure that that planning serves social needs rather than sort of financial accumulation. And I think that's, there's a whole host of things there to influence them, whether that's sort of social pressure, organizing, whether it's the work of groups like Positive Money and many others, brilliant organization that Mick runs or sort of is involved with. Like, there are a whole host of civil society organizations putting pressure on these, but it's also about building, political education, popular pressure from below, but also in sort of like the intermediate class. So I guess it's always going to be a multi-dimensional strategy, but I think exactly because the crisis is so systemic, so sort of multiple faceted, even these institutions, and I think interesting to look at something like what Janet Yellen has been saying at the Treasury Department in the US around sort of systemic crisis we're facing. Even these institutions, which historically, as I say, have been sort of fairly monolithic and sort of bastions of the status quo, are beginning to recognize that, given the scale of disruption coming towards us, things need to change and change radically. And so the question is, can we bend that towards equity, bend that through democratic processes towards sort of socially good ends?
Laurie, do you want to come in? Or?
No, that's a great answer. That's
right.
a great, I would, yeah.
So we've got a lot of questions in the chat about kind of what people can do, entry points for change, that sort of stuff. So I've got one question here, which is, which groups or movements would you recommend supporting to fight for climate justice?
I'll throw three out there. I've always found a website called Radical Ecological Democracy useful to check out. There's some fantastic writing on there, particularly from groups in the Global South, and it's a bit of a clearinghouse for getting a lot of perspectives from across the world, and a really good place if you do find yourself in, sort of wondering about the echo chamber that you're in, particularly in countries like the UK, and you want to make sure you're more engaged in the incredibly vibrant and very long-running conversation in the Global South. It's a good one to check out. Closer to home, here in the UK, Green New Deal UK, the group that's doing a lot of campaigning around the Green New Deal. I would definitely check them out. You Google them, you better find their website. And then I'm going to throw this out there. I think the Conservative Environment Network, CEN, C-E-N, is one to check out as well, because I think it's very important to make sure at a time where the Conservative government here in the UK is the party of net zero, partly because of the privilege of being government. It's really important to understand the perspective of the Conservative angle on this. Now, for many of you, of course, that's about the critique of it, but I think it's also really important to have that perspective on how they are grappling with the next stages of what carbon reductions, for example, will require. And the target that the government has signed up to by 2035, this one that's nearly 80%, is astonishing. And Fatima, the head of Green New Deal UK, was on Sky the other day saying about, this will require large changes to how society works in the UK. And then Julia Hartley-Brewer, the right-wing commentator, So this is an astonishing admission here on Sky that this person has just said that we're going to have huge changes to our societies. And, we will. It's a very complex stories we're exploring. There are huge benefits that we'll get along the way. And to see how communities in the Conservative movement, both within and out of the Tory party, grapple with the huge changes that we will need as we go down, in the case of the climate crisis, emissions reductions, I think is a really important discussion to be a part of and to see. So those would be my three that I would go for.
I mean, I think the question is twofold. How can we build social power? Collective democratic power that we can sort of begin to sort of cohere and then leverage into sort of whether it's formal politics, our workplaces, wherever it might be, and also build solidarity. Solidarity both within sort of the UK, within our communities, but I think centering global solidarity as well. And I think when you take those two together, well, what can you do? Well, I think there's just like sort of there's an endless list of options in some ways. So it's and I think it's important not to sort of have emotional burnout. And the last few years have been an emotional roller coaster, I guess, for many in British politics and beyond. But so I'd say, join a trade union if you're sort of in work and, sort of build power there. Make sure you're sort of thinking about like how workers are going to be at the forefront of managing just transition in your industry. Think about joining a renters union if you're sort of renting and, centering demands for sort of decarbonised housing stock. Think about sort of, there's a whole host of sort of environmental movements that are sort of organizing on the streets and sort of but then also connect up all the different struggles against carceral anti-carceral justice, migrants' rights, sort of anti sort of gender violence rights. These are all connected towards sort of the fundamental overarching system of capitalism, which has got these has got these propulsive forces that are gendered, that are racialized, that are deeply unequal. And against that propulsive force, our best hope lies in the collective, lies in the building up of social power and solidarity. And the real sort of strength and virtue we have is there's a whole host of institutions, a whole host of sort of spaces and social sort of arenas in which we can come together and begin to build that sort of power. And Laurie visited some, and sort of there's some more. So I guess there's plenty. That's the good news. Good
to know. And definitely echoing Matt's comments there to join a trade union and a renters union. We really need to be building power in our workplaces as well as on the streets. So last question, what do you think are the best strategies to prevent the environmental movement from being channeled purely into this modified status quo approach?
Critical question. I think that going beyond a focus just on the science into the kind of causes of the causes of how our economic structures have led to the situation that we're in, I think is absolutely critical. And something to equip yourself here when you're talking about this is to go back to and I'll tweet about this if anyone wants to get the location of this quote. The UN and the IPBES, which is the UN sort of science body for biodiversity loss, for the destruction of the natural world and species. In one of its reports, it says very clearly that we don't just need to swap dirty technology for clean technology. That's a crucial part of it. We need to go a bit deeper to the enablers of that and change our economic systems fundamentally in paradigms and goals and values, and it lists all these kind of things off, right? And to connect, as Matt's alluding to, to foreground elements of the economic status quo, of economic policy that are clearly not up to the task, even if they've been modified. This modified status quo approach is absolutely key. So in the UK, for example, the fixation on the myth of a deficit being the greatest determinant of what's possible in society or not is about a whole range of issues, one of which is being able to deal with the environmental crisis, right? Financial regulation is one of those crucial issues. The list of workplace rights and the ability for you to have some say over what your company is doing and how it relates to the natural environment. And the list goes on and on and on. And making sure that you're always able to take a selection of the key pillars of what we need to be doing to change economic policy and linking that to the goals that the status quo is kind of signing up to. And it's astonishing to see this 78% reduction target that the UK government has now signed up to, 78% reduction of emissions on the amount that we were pumping out in 1990 by 2035. I mean, it requires an extraordinary change in how society works. You know, in the age of like the time you're going to be at school, if you just started school now, if you're going to primary school now, you know, that kind of time scale is what we're talking about here. And so to constantly point back to, well, these are the goals you signed up to, this is what the science is saying, and this is the kind, you know, you're clearly not allowing the economic enablers, the policies that will actually get you there, I think is one of the key things to be doing. And there's a huge amount of opportunity for that in the context of a status quo that is reeling from what the pandemic has exposed. So that would be, my first bash.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the sort of obvious risk in that, you know, the modified status quo will be, you know, inadequate to tackle the deep injustices in our societies, but also inadequate to drive this sort of scale of transformation, which is not just linked to decarbonisation, but environmental sort of stress in the round, whether it's, you know, sort of biodiversity, soil fertility. And I think in some ways, you know, everyone seems to say, well, okay, well, you know, a bit like the levelling up agenda, and okay, let's take them on their own sort of premises. So it's like, okay, they've announced this, you know, very ambitious in some ways, although, you know, if you base it on the fair shares approach, not ambitious enough, but like this ambitious sort of 2035 target. But then, you know, then the politics becomes not about a target, but how you get there. And that's when it becomes, you know, clear that relying on the sort of institutions, the market mechanisms, the sort of like priorities, who has voice in the economy, the type of incentive structures, there's going to have to be a big shift in how we approach a whole host of different sectors, how we hope to financing those, how we help sort of govern those sectors. And so some say, okay, great, sure, you're beginning to at least recognize the urgency of the problem. You're beginning to sort of, you know, sort of set the type of targets that, you know, aren't ambitious enough, but, you know, begin to sort of, you know, begin to at least try to sort of put ambition at the forefront. Now is the real hard task of the tools. What are the tools you're going to do to deliver those targets? And in opening up that sort of Pandora's box, I think actually sort of the status quo will find it difficult because it's, you know, you know, there will be sort of incremental improvements, I'm sure, but will it be at the pace and scale required? And will it be with equity at the core? And on both those things, I think, again, it goes back to that point about mobilizing social power in all forms, not just in formal sort of, you know, Westminster politics, but in all sort of, you know, settings, workplaces, you know, housing, sort of environmental movements, and sort of the whole panoply of social movements, mobilizing that power and then building that to create leverage. And that's the best way to sort of make sure the modified status quo doesn't sort of win out, because I think that'll be deeply inadequate to the scale of the crisis facing us.
I think we might have time for just one more question. So if you could both answer relatively quickly and then we'll wrap up. How can the left avoid accusations of opportunism and of trying to shoehorn socialism into any response to the climate crisis?
Good God. Outrageous. Matt, do you want to go first? I'll give you this one first.
I'm just getting my shoehorn out. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, in some ways, you know, the challenge is to popularize socialism and sort of, you know, win socialism, and the natural byproduct of that is a world of equity and the sort of an economy organized towards social and environmental needs. And so a byproduct of that is exactly responding with the scale, the ambition, the necessity we need in the face of the climate crisis. So, you know, in some ways you can't sort of separate them out. And I think, you know, politically that is about building a big boat. So it's about, you know, liberals and social democrats and all the rest of there, but the programmatic drive thrusts towards those things I've talked about: democratic planning, public investment, reimagining sort of the rules and the ownership structures and the sort of governance forms of the institutions that sort of are currently driving us towards breakdown, but could be vital allies, whether they're, you know, forms of enterprise, forms of community business, vital allies in the building up of this post-carbon world. So I think, you know, obviously there has to be sort of lesson learning, stock taking, reflection, but at the same time, it is about building a majoritarian sort of, you know, popular bloc to confront, you know, the sort of deeply embedded sort of, you know, political formation of fossil capital, you know, a reactionary sort of nationalism. And it's, you know, it's the fight of our lives, but I think, you know, it's about building that big left popular bloc. And that, you know, isn't about shoehorning, it's just about facing up to the realities and, you know, confronting them without turning away from them.
Good answer. Laurie?
Yeah, and great question. The Crack Fox 08 and the Sauron's eye that you've got there as your avatar, which you do not apologize for. it's what the environmental crisis brings, that eye that is then focused on us, that I think is partly the solution here. We say in the book, we say in the book, you know, we need systemic changes. Here is our bash at drawing together a number of them. You don't have to call this socialism. Call it what you want. I mean, we're not sure either, you know, and that may not be the best word to be using. You know, for many communities, it probably absolutely isn't the best word to be using. But as two things will happen a number of things will happen in decades, but two particular things are important. One is that we will be reducing emissions or we won't, and we will be trying to repair the natural environment or we won't. And it will be very clear if certain things are not working that we need to be changing an approach. Hence the potential failure of this modified status quo approach, and making the arguments that it has not got the proper systemic change that it needs to enable the things that it claims it wants to do is key. The second thing that will happen, terrifyingly, is that destabilization will grow. And it is imperative to ensure that as that happens, progressive communities, all communities, are ensuring that the focus remains on the root cause of the problem. In many respects, environmentalism over the last number of decades has been akin to warning of a storm in the distance that we're heading to in a ship or something, and that we need to change bearing and we'll avoid it. The bearing was not changed, and we accelerated into the storm. And trying to get out of it while you're in the storm is materially different to warning about it before you get into it. And we need to make sure that at all times we are warning of the risk that the storm hitting us inundates, overcomes our focus on trying to get out of it. And in doing that, we need to make sure that we're seeing a greater we that moves out across the world. So we're holding us all together in the embrace to try and deal with this problem and to deliver the systemic change that we need. And I think that that's the other thing that we need to have at the forefront of our minds as the destabilization is growing.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight for this fantastic event. That is all we have time for. The recording will stay up on the TWT YouTube channel for anyone who wants to watch it again or share it with friends and comrades. Finally, a reminder, you can get 50% off the book on Verso's website using the link in the chat, which I think will come up again in a minute. There you go. And have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this fantastic event on this brilliant book. Bye-bye.